Welcome back. The nature of investments needed for India's green transition. We have with us Ms. Archana Chaudhary, Associate Director, Climate Trends. The session will be moderated by Mr. M. Ramesh, Consulting Editor, The Hindu Business Line. May I invite them to begin?
Now, after listening to Professor Chandrasekhar about how the global south has been shortchanged in terms of climate finance, we all take a deep breath, accept the reality, and see what best we can do given the circumstances. So that is what Archana is going to tell us now, the nature of finance that is needed. I have great pleasure in bringing in Archana here, a former colleague of mine. She worked with Business Line, been a journalist for a quarter century or so. More than a quarter century, was my colleague in Business Line. And then she worked in Bloomberg. And then she's now with Climate Trends, an organization that you must all, anybody who is connected to climate, is interested in climate, must know Climate Trends. It's a think tank. It's also a communications facilitating company set up by another dear friend of mine, Aarti Khosla, doing extremely well. They bring out some classy, very, very good reports also on climate change. They attend all the COPs and stuff like that. So she's now associate director with Climate Trends. This is basically what she said. And now, in which capacity she engages with a lot of people, many companies, corporates, Niti Aayog, and so on. This is what Archana gave ACJ when we asked for her bio sketch. But that's too modest. I am too smart for that. She's also, this is something that she didn't mention. She was also an award-winning journalist. She has won not less than 3 awards that I know of. She may have won more. I'm sure she's going to win many more. She's won 3 awards for excellence in reporting on 3 different subjects. One of them is environment, the other is women's issue, and the third one, I forget which. Two on environment. So anyway, so she's that kind of a person. So we're all very eager to listen to her. But before that, just for form, to this audience, I know, and after Professor Chandrasekhar's speech, I don't need to do anything by way of setting the context, but still, I will just take 2 minutes to make some two broad points, and then I'll get out of the way. The first is, as was just told to us, we need a lot of money. How much money do we need to make, let's say, we have different targets, some targets by 2030, some by 2035, some by 2050, and net zero by 2070. What is the order of funds that we need? You Google up, you will get all kinds of figures. One common theme that runs across all these is that the money is enormous. Huge amounts of money is what we need. And for no reason other than that this estimate was the most recent, I will take the one that was put out by Niti Aayog just a couple of 2-3 weeks back, I think early February. Niti Aayog says to meet India's net zero goals by 2070, we're going to be needing something like $22.5 trillion. Now, you do the simple division, you come to a figure of $65 billion a year starting from now. That is the amount of funds you need. We are getting something like half of that now. Now, in order to double that right from now, it's not something easy. That is one point that I just wanted to make. This is something that everybody knows. We need huge sums of money. Where are we going to get it? How is it going to happen? We don't know. Archana will throw some light on this. The second point, very quickly, is that fortunately, the Indian financial sector, the Indian financial regulatory sector are becoming more climate aware. Now, we've been covering climate for a decade or so. This is a change that we see now. I hope Archana will bear me out. Compared with, let's say, 5 years back or so. 5 years back, the financial sector was not so climate aware. Today, it is getting more and more climate aware. Some of you may have read that only last year, the government of India came out with what they call the draft National Climate Finance Taxonomy. Taxonomy the system of classification. So what counts for climate finance, what is this, what is that, the taxonomy, it is still in draft stage, that will come up now. And a year earlier than that, the RBI came out with, for banks and financial institutions, a framework for climate finance disclosures. Now, I'm just making these 2 points just to illustrate that the financial sector is becoming more and more climate aware. Many banks are looking at it more carefully. Bank of Baroda among a few banks that are in the forefront that I know of. So this is the context in which we are saying, as Professor Chandrasekhar mentioned, we are shortchanged, we are not getting what we should be getting. I mean, not just India, global south. And then the quantum of funds required is huge, mind-boggling amounts of funds we require. And third, we are going to be seeing more and more climate-aware financial sector. This is broadly the setting behind which, against which Archana will be speaking to us. So with that, yes, I'll get out of the way. And Archana, you have 30 minutes to speak, and then we'll wait for question and answers. Okay? Or maybe let's say take 40 minutes or so, and I'll get out of the way with that.
Thank you so much. Thanks a heap, Ramesh. You're very kind. And thank you also. Thank you also, Mr. Shashikumar. Thank you, Preeti. Thank you, Khushbu. Thank you, Lakshmi, all of you all, for bringing me back to ACJ after so many years. I passed out in 1998, 99. That was my batch. So yeah, I'm a fossil. But so good to have, to come here and see all this enthusiasm on climate, to see the kind of questions that are coming, and it really gives me a lot of hope for journalism and for climate. So thanks a lot for being such a wonderful audience already. Let me start off by a couple of thoughts. Just as Ramesh was saying, we're talking about climate finance, we're talking about flows. We've already heard in the morning, the stage has been set really well. But before I start, I just want to understand how many in the audience here understand our rudimentary understanding even of how finance flows work in any economy. Are there any economic students? Are there? Perfect, perfect, quite a few of us. Quite a few of us who are also part of the Bloomberg program, so wonderful. So what I am going to do today is start with the journalism story, because why not? If you all remember the Watergate scandal, I don't know how many of you all have heard of it, which threw the American president, the only American president who had to resign amid a scandal in the recent past was Richard Nixon, and the scandal was called Watergate. And you had two really sharp reporters, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, who were taking tips from Deep Throat, who was their source, who never revealed himself. And we found out only much, much later who he was. And they couldn't make the final link to bring that scoop to their front pages. And Deep Throat gave them only one advice. And that is the advice that I would like to start today's session with, which is follow the money. It doesn't matter what we need to understand as journalists, as long as we understand where the money came from, where it went to, and who benefited and who was left behind. It's a simple framework, but it has always worked. And so let's look at that framework when it comes to financing India's green transition. I am not going to go into details of the international politics has covered it really well. The fact that we are shortchanged, yes, true. But it is also true that we need to see what is actually happening on the ground. And what is happening, irrespective of the jargon that we're using, irrespective of what the budget says, doesn't say, it's what we are doing as an economy. I think one of the positives that I would like to highlight is that irrespective of what is happening, we as a country don't need to explain or even debate amongst ourselves that climate change is real, it's happening, and we need to do something about it. And in that, irrespective of the inefficiencies of the government, something is moving. There is a transition happening. We are hearing stories across our papers on energy systems, on industry and production, on land, food, forests, agriculture, ecosystems. We're talking about how our cities can be better because heat is hitting us, floods are hitting us. The impacts are real. And so the changes are real, even though their pace may not be to the liking. Our core problem, like Ramesh was saying, and this is a slightly different figure, actually, there are multiple figures. So this is one of the figures that is not the Niti Aayog figure, one of the higher ones where it goes right up to $250 billion annually required in the next 3-4 years if we are to do anything substantial. And obviously, one of the problems that we're facing, and that is what even Sir discussed, is that we are treating climate finance as a separate thing and a one-size-fits-all kind of architecture, which is what we are getting from the West when we go to COPs. This is what in the last few COPs that I have attended, I've been listening to, that somehow climate finance is a different section that you have got to pay attention to and treat it as one thing. Maybe it's not. Because when we're talking about these kind of figures where there's a 20 trillion requirement, there's a gap of 450 billion, but international finance is expected to meet. It's not meeting. It's expected to meet less than half. And the truth is, as we discussed all morning, there's no hope of even that coming, really. Our challenges as India are dual. We all know that. We've been talking about a Viksit Bharat 2047, for better or for worse. That's the target the government has set for us. Target or pipe dream, we'll find out. But the progress is being made. We're seeing that we've already done certain things. And frankly, compared to a lot many more developed economies, I think we need to be able to sit and honestly acknowledge that some progress has been made. Our emission intensity has reduced. This is our non-fossil fuel capacity, installed capacity. Whether we're using all that capacity is a different story, but it has been done, which means investments went into it. Our current annual flows are a healthy 335 billion, of which 87 billion are going into clean energy, which means somebody is investing in a cleaner energy economy. And yet, we have a huge gap because we are the world's largest population and we are the world's fastest growing economy. Having said that, I'm not going to read out all these figures because we've already gone over a lot of this. As a country which is a global south country, these are things that we need to be aware of. And Chandrabhushan also talked about the fact that most of the flows of money from in the international system are going towards East Asia, Western Europe, Northern America. So we are getting a limited amount of that. This is what the 1.9 trillion figure that CB mentioned in the earlier session looks like. This is where it's going. So we got barely a very, very small amount of that 1.9 trillion, just 57 billion through instruments, and we have just like the smallest 133%, 133 billion coming through grants. Low-cost finance is really low, is unavailable. What is coming is through markets, investments. So although the investors, the market is a ruthless place, they understand opportunities and risks, and they can see the risks, which is why we're seeing investments coming in. So let's keep this, and we can come back to this later. But what we need to see is whether we can get funding at a reasonable rate or funding that is like the professor said, ideally should be reparations. Historically, if we were to go by it, whether those grants will come our way. The hope is low, but as our risks mount, we need to keep this in mind and keep negotiating for it. Let's talk about the actual problem now, which is that finance treats everything as the same. We were talking about the moral imperatives of markets, and really markets don't have moral imperatives. And I think we know that by now. As much as we'd like the world to move in a particular direction, we have to accept that the world isn't moving in that direction. The markets are not going to be moral. They are going to look at profits, and they're going to prioritize that before everything else. This is a figure that Ramesh just mentioned, and so did Sir before him. This is a recent NITI Aayog report wherein we are saying $22.7 trillion by 2070. How many zeros in a trillion, guys? Bloomberg? Students? Absolutely. 12 zeros to a trillion. And we are talking about $22.7 trillion. That's a huge amount. But what is happening when we are looking at the investments that we need is that when we talk about these investments in the market, we are dealing with a solar farm and a transmission line and a carbon capture plant in fundamentally the same way, although they have different investment profiles, right? We're ignoring that reality, and there is a big gap of 6.5 trillion. So these figures are going to be the basis of our discussion today, and we'll come back. So I have based, like a journalist should, all these figures on 2 reports that I think are illustrative of the money flow numbers that are credible and which will matter. So one is the NITI Aayog report, and the second is a CEW report, which talked about the adaptation economy. More on that later. So I'm not going to go over these again, but let's remember that there is a 6.5 trillion gap that we are going to have, which is going to increase over time, and we'll figure out why. Where is the money currently going? We see that most of the investments, when we talk about our transition, is going into power. So $12.3 trillion, which is more than half of our total investments, are should be going into renewables, storage, transmission, and distribution. This is the ideal scenario, according to NITI. Industries are to get 6.1 trillion, which means about a third of investments go into steel, cement, green hydrogen, and CCUS. And then there's transport. Transport is the most visible transition that we're seeing apart from solar. We all know EVs are happening at a very rapid pace. So this is something that the markets have run with already. But this is not the complete picture, because although it covers mitigation and it covers the main sectors of the economy, if we are going to have a green economy, then we have to take into account our circular economy, our informal economy, which we find as journalists, it's not really talked about from an economic lens. We see it in impact stories. We see impact stories that talk about heat hitting gig workers. We read about floods hitting small hotels and businesses in towns, but we really don't see the informal economy addressed as a story in our transition stories. How much is that according to CEW? That's a $400 to $600 billion hole, which we are not paying attention to. As journalists, that's where we need to look at. And according to CEW, getting this piece right is going to create 30 million jobs for us. That's 3 crore jobs, which is not a small amount for a country like India. So here's what, I changed it later to 3 pillars, but essentially this is what our changes are going to. This is where the money has to flow to, right? A $4.1 trillion cumulative investment required for Viksit Bharat across 36 value chains. This is what NITI talks about. A big chunk of it, again, these are just NITI figures. I'm not going to repeat all of them, but look at the jobs figures there. That is the other story that we need to look at, a lens through which we need to look at where our green economy is transitioning. Is enough money going into creating jobs? And what kind of jobs? So 48 million jobs, right? Across what? A big chunk of it in energy, but a big chunk of it has to come through the circular economy. And when they say 23 million bioeconomy, what we're talking about is agriculture, the rural sector. Again, a sector that really does not find as much mention as we need to have in our coverage of transition. This is what we're missing. This is where the money is going to come. So there is a $132 billion annual market that we will be creating just in transition-related sectors by 2047, which means 8.4 million jobs, 84 crore jobs. MSM, sorry, 8.4 million will not be 84 crore. I'll correct myself. 8.4 crore jobs. Or less than that. How much is that? 6 zeros, 7 zeros. 84 lakh jobs, sorry. Thank you for correcting me. Our MSME and heavy sector needs a different kind of financing. Okay, we'll come to what kind of financing this will need. Let's get our picture right, or at least from my perspective right. Waste collection, recycling infrastructure alone can create 7.6 million jobs. Resource security, so this is the money that you will be saving. A story that we are not talking about enough. What happens if we do things right? How much do we save? And every penny saved is a penny earned. We are going to be eliminating 93% copper imports, 100% of our lithium dependence, which is a big chunk of money saved. We're talking about only 20 to 25% of waste being recycled currently. And this is going to require a separate kind of attention when it comes to finance. A supply chain finance, we're going to need working capital for our MSMEs, and we're going to need platforms that aggregate this. So that's where the opportunity is for money to flow. The other is the rural economy part that I just mentioned. So you're going to have a 415 billion annual market in bioeconomy and rural economy according to CEW. Big chunk of jobs being created there also, but what you are creating through, the jobs are coming in for is organic agriculture, from forestry, from wetlands. Also, reducing import dependency, saving money. This is where our focus on agriculture finance needs to be. This is where there are stories that need to be unearthed and questions to be asked to agencies like NABARD on what it is that we're doing and where is that money going to come from. Because this is going to require us to look at the traditional forms of financing which are available, but also how these forms are now being, how these forms of finance are being made available across and we'll come to the ESG part of this equation as part of that, where the gender responsive instruments talk. So to sum up, we have a gap. This is where the gaps are maximum at the moment, but this is only mitigation, okay? This is where our biggest gaps are going to be, where our returns are uncertain, so the markets are not going to step in, and paybacks are going to be for over longer periods of time. So we need to be aware of what those gaps are. There are 3 kinds of investments that we're going to need to meet 3 kinds of our financing needs. Type 1 is what works. So bankable returns, private capital. We'll figure out where it goes, right? So this is the most easy part of this piece, which we're doing right already. There is a bottleneck, which is the unsexy ones, the risk sharing, where you're going to have a bigger risk. So government needs to step in with help. And finally, there is R&D, the money that goes into technologies that are not yet come, because we are going to need technologies to get us out of this mess. So that is where 3 different kinds of investments will require 3 different kinds of financing. One is where markets already work for us, which is solar, wind. We're already seeing there is predictable returns, the market is formed, there is technology, there is policy support. Private investors are already lining up. This is more or less a successful story. If you look at it from there are many hitches, but at the moment, installed capacity is a good story for India. Renewables, I'm not going to read through all of these because these are figures that you will find on the internet, but this is what I meant, because Andhra Pradesh alone can pull in 82,000 crores. All our states in a country like India are looking at these opportunities. And so are our investors, because these are the easy finds, relatively. This is where we already have private money. We have IREDA allocations, budget allocations, PLI scheme has already come in, 24,000 crores. We already have sovereign bonds looking at benchmark pricing. We already have 145 billion invested over the last 1 decade. Easy piece. Yeah, this is where it's coming from. I'm just going to leave this here for any of y'all. Y'all can please, I'll share the presentation later if y'all are interested. But this is the breakup. What is the second kind of investment? This is where infrastructure nobody wants to fund. Why? Because this is the tougher part. Now we built our grids. There is a huge solar plant in Rajasthan, but the power requirement is in Mumbai. How do you get that there? You're going to need a transmission grid, and you're going to need a transmission grid that works according to the solar capacity. Solar capacity is going to go down at night. So you're going to need storage and massive amounts of storage. But that's not an easy thing, because this is, if you build a storage, you're going to require to get back your investment only much later, right? It's going to be 5% return on investment at best, compared to just setting up a power plant and letting it run. So EV charging, for instance, again, there was a question in this morning, and there's a good conundrum there also in the EV space. People are buying the EVs, but who builds the chargers? Because the requirement is massive. Let's unpack this. So transmission grids, this is the kind of monies that we're going to require. For evacuating just 500 gigawatts, you're going to need 2.4 lakh crores, that's 2.4 trillion rupees. So why? Like I just said, solar farms will give you a higher return, transmission give you a comparatively lower return, and some of these investments will take decades, which is not a patience that a private sector company has. Our budget, for instance, has allocated a 600 crore investment for a green energy corridor, because it's not like the government is not aware of it, but obviously this is not the kind of allocations that are going to work for a country like India and requires more thinking, and questions need to be asked. Our state governments, okay, I shouldn't say broke, that's unfair. Many of them are close to being broke, but they're not at the moment. But having said that, they don't have the money to build intrastate transmissions. Transmission lines, it's not there, not necessarily always the state distribution companies, but that have to do it. But even the center is not able to put in the kind of investments that are required in building these connections. It's the same problem with EV charging infrastructure. We're seeing Tata Power is building a charging network, fine. But the volume is such, 72,300 stations. You're not going to be able to get that kind of funding easily unless there is help. There are no EVs without chargers, no chargers without EVs, so how do you break this jam? And there are interesting conversations happening currently in the EV space on this. You're not going to have private sector building it, which means with what Sir was talking about, de-risking and blended finance, a part of it, maybe. But ultimately, unless you work at building this kind of a market, you're not going to see that kind of a transition, which is going to be our challenge. And again, questions need to be asked. How do you fund it? This is the other piece. We have been talking a lot about MDB funding, and a lot of us have been writing about multilateral development banks. But in a Trumpian world, it's not the easiest of options. And if the world continues down that path, we're going to have to think about where we are going to get our public risk capital. Who will fund these kind of infrastructure projects? Will they be able to really take the first loss position that Sir was talking about? Whether investors will be able to follow at scale. I mean, unless that happens, investors won't follow. They need guarantees. They need replicable models for their businesses. How do you create this? This is, again, something that we are discussing. I know for sure that in policy circles in Delhi, this is one of the discussions. So, to come back to the NITI data, 82% of total financing gap is in power sector, which is not in generation. Our biggest gap is in power sector for transmission, distribution, and storage. For transmission and distribution, we have regulated entities, which means that we have to really think about how our market itself is built. We'll need to ask questions not just about clean finance, climate. We need to ask questions about our basic structures, our basic development structures. How are our utilities regulated? How are the returns capped? Where will concessional finance come from? We need to ask questions on what technology to use for a grid scale, storage. How do you build that? Who pays the cost? Who are the companies working on this? If we're going to talk about a big financing gap widening post 2050, we're going to have to ask questions. Is offshore wind really the right thing for us to do? Because that's what the government is talking about. How are we going to put together the capital expenditure that will be required to scale up when our companies are risk averse, when private capital is not willing to put money in India's green, for green development or development of any kind? So these are questions that as journalists we need to be aware of and need to be asking. Now finally, there's a third part. Where will the investments go? In technologies that don't exist. And I know that there is a lot of excitement around green hydrogen and carbon capture and all sounds really nice and shiny. But the truth is that all these solutions are expensive and they're unproven. Why are we talking about them? Because a chunk of our greening of the economy has to happen in what we call the hard-to-abate sectors, which are about a fifth of our commitments. Hard-to-abate sectors, which means steel and cement. So 70-80% of our emissions are from fossil fuels. There's no commercially viable green alternative for steel and cement at the moment. Green hydrogen at the moment is at least 4 times more expensive. CCUS is something that we are sinking money in or trying to, but the production costs are really high, and no private sector investor will be willing to fund technologies at scale. We're not doing basic R&D in India. So how do we do this? How do we work on research and development? Is anyone working on it? Where can we get access to those technologies? Will it come from countries like China? In that case, geopolitically, how feasible will that be? So we are at a point basically where geopolitics, trade, and climate are all merging with our economics. And as journalists, we need to be aware of it. We need to be asking questions from multiple lenses, not just one. But anyway, moving on. I won't spend too much time on this. This is self-explanatory in terms of just why it is difficult to fund green hydrogen. Carbon capture, what the government announced in their budget. Huge costs of setting up just one plant, no revenue stream. Why would anyone set it up? What do they get out of it at the moment, apart from the oil companies, who are the ones pushing for carbon capture? So let's go back. This is what the NITI data says to us. Our gap is going to explode after 2050, and there are fundamentally different investments that are going to require fundamentally different answers. Green hydrogen, CCUS, EV batteries, and how do you create or find the funding for these technologies which don't at the moment work, but we think they will. This is our storyline of the money that we require in India. So from now to about 2050, we continue to focus on our scaling of renewables, and there will be commercial finance coming in, hopefully, even in storage as well as transmission. We are seeing a lot of private companies also talk about this, and we're seeing the ADBs of the world, the World Banks of the world also talk about funding them. Then there's a second stage where the merging of the grid infrastructure, charging, storage, everything comes together. This is a utopian idea, but this is where we are at. And finally, the critical stage where the R&D that we're doing now and the technologies that we're helping fund research on will start paying dividends, and we will have them online to be able to take our green transition forward. So the gap grows much later. At the moment, at least, we are in a position domestically to be able to fund much of this transition, which is the good news, and then the questions. So we are already doing the heavy lifting. Unlike other countries, the SIDS And all those who are following COPs will have already heard all these names. The low-income countries, whether it is countries that are coming together, the smaller countries, small island developing nations, or the small low-income LDCs, right? Least developed countries. Unlike them, because we are the size that we are able to gather, raise our own funds, and most of our climate initiatives or transition initiatives are being funded domestically, 83%. We need more international funding. There is no doubt about that. But even if that does not come, it will slow us down, according to most estimates. But if we continue on the trajectory that we're on, we will get there at some point. And 2070 is really a long way off. So at the moment, we're already seeing our domestic funds, our banks are saying the same thing, our household savings are being looked at, corporate bonds, the government is talking about all of these things. There is some amount of international funding coming in, which is critical for our next stages. But the crowding out risk, of having limited domestic capital, simply because our economics, currently the way it is working, our private sector is not taking risks, is not investing. That is a big risk that we need to think about and ask questions of. So what should it look like? This is what ideally our climate financing should look like. We should be investing commercial finance with policy support in our solar and wind. We should be looking at blended finance, guarantees, first loss, MDB capital that Sir was talking about, for our type 2, which is our bigger infrastructure that is more risky. We need to have grants and ultra-concessional loans, which hopefully go towards our R&D, which is a big chunk, which will come later for hard-to-abate sectors. But most importantly, we need funding for our MSME, for our cooperatives. We need patient capital that can, this is where the government funding ideally should be going in. I put in carbon markets there, but I would like to hear more, on.
Patient capital,
Yeah.
You don't need capital that is cheap, no? Maybe we should call it patience capital.
Patience capital, okay. Patient capital. The patient is also a verb. Thanks to you. Yeah. Yeah, didn't mean to confuse folks, but yeah, patient capital and transition that allows us to create jobs, because that is where the biggest need is, in the informal economy, in the MSMEs. So we've got to stop treating climate finance as one basket, one bucket, at least in India, as India, and we need to look at, not look at one size fits all kind of answers for our challenges. Now, there are multiple policy challenges that we're facing, because given the kind of geopolitical place that we're at, the breaking down of the multilateral system, the rise of President Trump, the breaking of the transatlantic alliance, the changing of the world order in a way where financial systems have gone into a kind of freeze, and corporates are not sure about where they're going to invest and where they should take risks. Keeping all that in mind, we're going to see these challenges widen further, which requires us to ensure that we are working more coherently domestically, which means that we did talk about the taxonomy, but really there are multiple taxonomies, although the government has come out with its own. That taxonomy, like CB very rightly pointed out, is not exactly a thorough document. So there are multiple ways that investors are still looking at what climate finance itself is and what needs to be financed. So we need to ensure that we are not giving in to greenwashing. We are able to guard against, we need to be able to have a single reference framework, which we don't have in the country at the moment. We need to be able to adopt that climate finance taxonomy. We need to be able to have disclosures that are even. What do I mean by this? There is a Financial Stability Development Council. How many of y'all are aware of it? Anyone? So we have something called the FSDC in India, which was formed in 2010, post the 2008 shake-up that happened, global financial shake-up that happened. And under the FSDC, you have the RBI, SEBI, the Secretary of DEA, the Secretary of DFS. You have everybody who looks at financial markets on one council. And that council is supposed to help us regulate and form policies harmoniously. None of us are even aware that it exists, so asking questions of it and whether we are actually doing it is not really obviously happening. So to be able to do that, also the BRSR, how many of you all are aware that there is something called a BRSR? Anyone? Folks covering companies? You all may not know it as BRSR, you all have heard of ESG? Yes? So there are disclosures that the top companies in the country have to make. They have got to, and every year those disclosures, they're pretty stringent, and they're supposed to show progress every year on those. Those are the BRSR disclosures. And we have to make that mandatory. At the moment, they started with 200 companies, 100 companies and 200, and they need to make it 1,000 companies. So if they do that, then their supply chains also have to make their disclosures on the ESG disclosures, which means that everybody needs to think in terms of change. So that is directionally we need to go there. And we need to have assurance of credibility, but let's move on. What we also need across the country is bankable project pipelines. What do I mean by that? It basically means that the way we design projects that we take to financiers for funding, they need to be bankable to begin with. Like, if somebody's going to take a risk, a lot of times, and this is something that the SIDS talk about at COP, smaller countries talk about at COP, is that they don't know how to design the project that they're going to take to the bank and say, fund this. Basic stuff. And we need to be able to educate our people, our companies, our electricity companies. We need to be able to train our folk to be able to do this better. This is actually something that I've heard a lot from across the development sector also. How do you create bankable, standardized project preparations? What are our models for energy efficiency? Municipal bonds, can we raise funds? Not look at just the center, not just the states, but also local funding being raised for local reasons. So Chennai doing municipal, Tamil Nadu had, I think, municipal bonds that were raised, was it Thoothukudi? They did a good job of it. But there are very, very few states that even understand how this needs to work, although there is more talk and awareness about it now. And then there is a demand aggregation for EVs. How do you do battery as a service? Basically, it requires us to work together and cooperate, to keep it really simple. There was a national green finance institution that the budget had talked about last year. This year, there was no mention of it. But as journalists, we need to ask questions about this. We need to ask, what the NGFI white paper, which is currently under development, what is happening? What is happening to those consultations? The regulators, investors, we need to go back and ask, what is its mandate? What are we refinancing? How are we handling first loss guarantees? What is that green finance institution going to look like? Who is it going to help? By when will it even be up and running? It is supposed to complement the IREDA on focusing on the difficult investments that need to be made, but there are no stories right now on it. Nobody's really asking. What we need from MDBs, again, first loss guarantees, concessional windows, we know all of this. But are we asking? Which are the MDBs that will work for us, especially in a Trumpian world? Is BRICS an answer? Is the NDB an answer? Are we looking at options? And what kind of concessional windows, what kind of co-investment platforms? And of course, the most important part. We are talking about a national adaptation plan. We've been talking about it for a while. Adaptation is where the money needs to come. This adaptation plan was supposed to be submitted around the COP or before the COP. The COP has come and gone. We don't know what has happened. We don't even have our NDCs submitted. We don't have, multiple disclosures that we were supposed to make as a country that have been put out. So then if we're not even talking about it and there are no questions being asked, how do you fund something as big as adaptation? Because that's literally where most of the money is going to go if we are to build a green economy. All our flood defenses, our drought resistance measures, even our HAPs. And of course, how do you ask if we don't present the documents or we are engaging at a multilateral level, if we are not presenting or submitting our own disclosures of NAP or NDCs, how do we then ask for commitments from our richer nation partners or from MDBs? And questions again that need to be raised. How are we unlocking domestic finance? Where is that money coming from? Are we in a position to look at this? Household financial savings are already there, right? India is amongst the highest savers in the world, or was at least. Our debt levels are rising. We need to be aware of that. Per capita debt, what is it? What is our per capita household savings? And can that be one of the capital pools that we look at to fund our own adaptation? Can we channel those via mutual funds? Can mutual funds have special, can there be special bonds coming out that talk about, bring in household savings and we are going to be investing in adaptation, this and this is the kind of returns we can give you? I don't know. I'm not an economist, but these would be answers, questions worth asking as a journalist. What is our green bond market on a retail level? Can we have tax incentives given? We can tax people, yes, but can there be incentives given for, and what kind of incentives? The corporate bond market, again, it's supposed to be expanding. Can we leverage that? Can the government step in and form policy that helps us do that? And what's happening to our sovereign green bonds? How can they provide benchmarking? And of course, our international finance strategy, which is again something that we need to look at. Can we scale our FDI? How can we have co-investment platforms? Can we have FPI access? Can Gift City be used to bring in money for climate purposes? Can we secure more MDB concessional finance? Can we demand for more grants? Essentially, we've seen one of the biggest reasons for investments not coming into climate across the globe has been the high cost of finance. Can that be addressed in some way? I know that this is all very dry, very boring stuff, but when you see the impact on the smaller countries and you hear them speak, when you hear a Mia Motley speak, this is what she is talking about. This is what she's feeling passionately about because she doesn't have enough money to save her people. And nor do we, frankly, unless we make all these changes. I'm not going to go over this again because I think we talked about this this is how I see the story, 3 simple sentences. We have a requirement for a green transition. There are 3 fundamentally different kinds of investments required. And these need to attract private capital. And we need to have technologies which don't exist at the moment. There is a gap. And this is an essential infrastructure which requires innovation. And so we're going to have to think about it and ask questions about where that gap is going to be filled and how we are going to match the finance that is required with the investment reality. So how are we going to bring that in? And for policy, how do you answer these questions? How do you ask these questions of policymakers? I think if I can leave this as a takeaway for you all, I will be happy if, even some of us can think about it, let alone ask questions. So I'll just stop there. Thank you so much.
That was wow. Quite wow presentation. Deeply insightful. Maybe we should give her another big hand. Lovely. Well done. Well done, Archana. She is not only highlighted the problems, but also given us hope by giving a matrix of options, a food court of options, if you will. You could pick and choose from them. Maybe you should have something from each stall of the food court. Blended finance is one, public finance is another, international finance is the third, and so on. Thank you very much for such a lovely, deeply insightful presentation. Now, I'll just ask one question and then open it for audience. Now, in terms of infrastructure that nobody wants to fund, that problem has generally been there all along. It's always been funded by public finance. Do you think that's happening? Because we do see investments coming in transmission at least, if not in other sectors that you mentioned. Transmission, some investments are happening. Do you think it is happening in the order, the scale consistent with the requirements?
I mean, a simple answer to that is no.
No.
But we are hearing, like, for instance, there are state governments, like MP, for instance, thinking about storage in a big way. Maharashtra is talking about storage in a big way. My hope, as cynical as that is, comes from the data centers that the Americans are bringing to India. If nothing else, they, because those data centers come into India and they are going to require stable power, and they will also have, ESG norms to follow. Hopefully, that is where we will see a certain amount of thinking or money flowing in, and hopefully that will be the kickstarting point, if it goes right.
Your presentation resonates with my own thinking on many of almost everything that you said here, particularly in terms of green hydrogen, CCUS. These are not things that will happen anytime soon. It may never happen also. But being a theist and a believer, I have hope that technology will deliver. God will deliver through technology. Do you think that will happen? For example, green hydrogen, it is way too costly today. By the way, I was sitting in a conference, in which Dr. Fatih Birol, the head of International Energy Agency, he was speaking, and he said green hydrogen is not happening today, tomorrow, or day after. It is for the future. It may never happen also. But, if green hydrogen can be produced by using solar energy and using seawater, maybe costs will come in handy. Do you think technology could be a solution here? Do you see that happening?
I think technology is a solution, yes. But we've got to think of whose solution. Just like we ask, whose truth? In journalism, whose truth? Where are we standing and saying this? We need to ask this, and I don't think anybody asks this question in climate and in finance as much anymore. We used to years ago. Technology will solve the problem, but for whom? And is that really the biggest chunk or biggest focus? Should it be the biggest focus? Ultimately, if we're looking at energy, then we already have some of our answers. Actually, the bigger problem and the bigger chunk of the population hit by these problems requires simple solutions. These can be simple technologies which are already available. A dredging of a pond, for instance. It's not cool, it's very unsexy, but that is what is solving their problem. Farm ponds across the agriculture sector, which ensures that even in droughts, they have water to grow their trees. Greenhouses, which are again, not exactly shiny things, but the reason why the shiny things get, I think, highlighted a lot more is because big money is attracted to those shiny things because it's big returns. But that is not where the answers may lie in the long run, or at least that seems like from common sense perspective. So while they are important and that technology will come and it will benefit some people, but if we are to look at ourselves as India as a country, then I think we should be looking at more unsexy but simple solutions which are already available and need to go after them systematically.
All right, I'll shut up now. Who wants to ask the first question? We'll go from the rear. Lady, you go ahead, please. I'll come to you in a moment.
Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Palak Gupta. So my question was, so there was a recent news article that under the government's offshore wind program, it released its first tender in Gujarat, but it was unable to draw any bids for its program. And in India, land acquisition is a very sensitive topic due to which government is unable to expand on the onshore wind projects. So it's turning to offshore wind energy. But there are higher upfront costs and higher capex expenditure that is required to actually delve into that part of the energy. So in Europe also, like the offshore wind power cost is rupees 10 per unit, and to get that cost, like even half that amount, rupees 5 per unit in India, government needs to increase its spending and increase the viability funding gap. So how do you think we can address this impediment when we talk about renewable energy sources currently in India? Like what can be done to expedite the process in the current times? If you would care to elaborate.
So offshore wind, is it going to happen? It's very costly. So what's the way out?
See, the thing with offshore wind is, and I've just recently spoken to someone who is part of that. You're right, it takes a lot of, it's a costly affair. But I think there's a technicality also there. There are very few states in India where offshore can work. Like Tamil Nadu is probably one. And I think Odisha, Gujarat and
Tamil Nadu and Gujarat only.
just two states that can really give you offshore, and that also if wind speeds allow. So I think instead of spending our time thinking about that, let the folks who are in offshore think about how they are going to be able to build capacities even in the current situation with the current, how big will its contribution then be? So as policymakers, I'm sure they are thinking about, how much of their time or this should be spent on trying to figure this out. How much viability funding will it require, and who will benefit from it ultimately if you have those, because it's a very, very technical issue. So I'm probably not the best person to say it's a great idea to do it or not. But I think if you just apply a common sense this from a policy perspective, then it's not one of the biggest problems that face our energy systems at the moment. And it might take time to solve, but I think it will be a handful of people who will have to think about it and resolve it, just like nuclear, right?
I will just add one little point to this, because it's the area I'm somewhat familiar with. We'll come to in a moment. Offshore wind is not happening, forget it. I'm not a cynic, but I tell you, it's not happening for a number of reasons. The best reason is that there's a huge potential, untapped potential onshore, which is far easier to do, far cheaper to do. Lot of potential. We talk to any wind industry people, personally will tell you, maybe we can do 10 times as much as we have done, or even more. So much untapped potential onshore, which is doable, cheaper. Offshore, as you mentioned, way too costly, and more than that, you don't have people to come and build it up for you. You need specialized ships, you need specialized equipment. They are all booked for a decade or so. Europe, it is possible because of shallow seas, where the foundation itself is very difficult, very easy to do and very cheap to do. And all these people who can build offshore farms are all already booked. So don't think about offshore now. Sir, please go ahead.
If I may say, Ramesh, I said to use a fossil fuel analogy, offshore is the natural gas of renewables, in a way. The amount of infrastructure spending that it will require, like natural gas requires. Like it's a parallel, perhaps.
Hi, ma'am. My name is Aryan Gupta. I just have two questions. So one thing is we were talking about energy transmission and power grids. So one of the problems that we face in our country is that even if a private player wants to develop that transmission grid, if I develop that, I need an assurance from the customers, for example, the state governments, that I will be supplying power to you for 10 years or so. But they don't get that assurance. That agreement is not signed. That power agreement is not signed, and hence they are not able to, maybe they are not willing to invest in the grid lines as well, whether you want to transfer via thermal or solar. So how much do we lack private and government collaboration on these fronts? And the next question that I want to ask is that we talked about gift city. So a lot of transition has been made when it comes to climate financing and giving tax breaks as well. But traditionally, our banking industry and finances, we have created a cap when it comes to foreign intervention because we want to control our currency as well. So how much changes would we see in that? Because a lot of times we were saved because of these caps and we were able to manage our currency better. So on those two things.
On your second one, actually, I'll go first. That was just that was one of the options that I was thinking, a very, very narrow, solution. Gift City has other issues and other, problems that I'm sure someone more qualified than me can answer. But really, that was just a very small thing to see whether we could bring in money through that. And taken on your this about caps, we require those because yes, especially in the current global situation, I think that stays. Your first question was about the transmission systems. Again, I'm not an expert, and probably Ramesh can weigh in well on that also in terms of.
Not an expert either.
But from whatever little energy I did cover, what happens, again, common sense answers is what we need. We don't need really complicated answers there, and I'm sure Sir, who's sitting behind, will be able to also weigh in on some of this. You don't really require, what you need to do is if you are looking at a situation where you don't want to bankrupt your state electricity boards and yet you want to be able to have your private sector investments coming in, then this is not a climate problem. This is a simple policy issue which requires political will. So that is not a problem that any expert sitting on a dais can solve. It again will get resolved only if these questions are asked of policymakers. So I'll just leave it at that.
Some investments are happening in transmission, especially long distance transmission. Particularly now the focus, you see, a lot of renewable energy is getting built in two states, Rajasthan and Gujarat. Kawada and,
Khavda.
yeah. So, and the investments in the load centers are in the east, upcoming states like Andhra Pradesh and Odisha. So they are building this transmission across. They are now trying to socialize the costs. Maybe the government will give some subsidy, maybe they will give some waivers and so on. Socialize. So probably that is the approach the government wants to take. Bring down transmission costs, let investments flow. And again, the heavy lifting is being done by, as far as I know, the government through its public sector companies, Power Grid Corporation and so on. So I think transmission is not as hopeless as some of the other areas that you see highlighted. Yes, lady, go ahead.
Good morning, ma'am. Hello, sir. My name is Asmi Bhatia, and my question is, we are seeing major economies like the US and China, they're focusing more on fossil fuels, and Trump recently also withdrew from the Paris Agreement and the UN Convention in January this year itself. When major economies are taking these steps, how badly is it going to impact India, and what can be done for the private investors to actually reduce their risk after seeing this turmoil that is happening, for them to actually invest in India?
Whoa. What a question. I mean, sorry, I'm just kidding, but really, who has the answers for those? Although I must correct you, I don't think China is walking away from fossil, walking towards, US is, yes, they're going back to fossil fuels, or so they say, and China, however, has actually doubled down on renewable. Canada, yeah. Good on Mark Carney, but the point is that I don't think we should think about these. I shouldn't say I don't think. I should say that if you really look at what their money is doing, it's more educational for us to understand the direction. Policymakers are there for certain number of years. But if you look at the US, for instance, they are very close to the solar becoming their biggest power source. That was a headline last week.
US, no?
Yeah. So we don't say, don't do as monkey do. Monkey say, do as monkey do. Right? So even they understand the risks. So there is no place on earth where they don't get those risks. And even in the US, already the transition has happened where even Elon Musk is going around saying things like solar is the future. So we have to see what they're doing, not what they're saying. And policies are always formed basis that. So I don't think we should worry too much about that. We should just plod on to the path that we're on and manage our risks better.
Ma'am, I get that. We should be looking towards what they're doing and not what they're saying because, again, it's Trumpian economy. I wanted to know what can be done specifically for the private players to actually invest more and make sure that they're actually not hesitant enough to put in their money because we are still seeing people are not really confident when it comes to the private players and it's mostly the public that is doing. So I wanted to know for private players what could be done more.
I don't know if there's a particular sector you have in mind, but if you're generically talking about the fact that private sector is not investing in India, I think the answer goes to a completely different direction, and that is building high trust economies, where a commercial pact is honored. You know, if a company is going to get paid for the product it delivers, it is going to take a certain amount of risk, right? When in regulated sectors, if regulation is designed in such a way that it is fair to everybody and oligopolies are not being formed, then maybe there will be more people taking risks. So this is a structural issue which we need to solve again. Simpler answers, not very complicated, but all based on policy implementation. So.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, sir. My name is Samriddhi Singh Mahar. When we were speaking of international funding coming in the years going forward, what are some of the solutions or the policies that the industry is looking to get the funding from abroad? And another question is that, are you seeing battery storage systems getting more investment with AI data centers coming in?
What should we do to get more international finance? And secondly, do you see investments happening in BESS, battery energy storage systems? You don't mean transportation, you know, not the EV battery, but grid, but the batteries that support wind farms and solar for BESS, BESS.
I think that is already happening.
That's
that
best is
hope is
happening.
already there. I won't say it's happening. I'll say that hope is already there. I met a lot of people in the Mumbai Climate Week who are, into battery storage and who are building batteries for their data centers and who are looking at renewables. So that hope is there. But as far as investments coming in from abroad, are you talking about a particular sector, or are you talking about all the sectors related to? I think that, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all. When it comes to investors coming in, say, an Elon Musk coming in is going to require a different kind of pound of flesh. And are we willing to pay that price is the question. So it will always be who is coming in and what do they want from us. There's actually a lot of investment coming in already. You're seeing a lot of EU businesses coming in. There's Germany, there's Finland, there's Australian companies working on water technologies. There's a lot of that kind of investment already coming in, but it's not being talked about as much. But if you're looking at the shiny Americans coming in, it'll really depend.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Yadu. You mentioned in one of the slides that about the elimination of lithium, like dependency on lithium. So, like, how is that practically possible given the entire EV market is reliant on lithium-ion batteries? And I remember, like, a couple of years back, a lot of people used to actually promote sodium-ion batteries, but you hardly see a couple of cars by some Chinese manufacturers who have built on sodium-ion. So how is this 100% dependency possible? Like, how is that elimination possible?
You made that point in the context of recycling.
Yeah. I mean, it was entirely, if you're recycling, then you don't need to import, right? That's what I meant, 93% copper and 100%
Okay,
lithium.
all right, yeah, I get it.
That point was made in the context of recycling, so that you use the same material over and again. And very quickly on sodium and lithium, you see, sodium ion, zinc, air, all these batteries will come. Sodium, you don't think of sodium in the context of mobility. It will never happen because the energy density is so low, you need a huge battery to run a vehicle. But sodium ion will happen, is beginning to happen for stationary applications. Like, it will happen over a period of time. Lithium will not go away. Lithium will also be there as a dominant player, but its market share will come down. That's a quick answer. Go ahead, please.
So, ma'am, one thing I wanted to know, since we discussed about US, China, one of the major players is EU also. So, China is going the other way because they dominate the supply chain when it comes to renewable energy, and US is obviously the Trumpian one. But when we focus on EU, so currently, recently we had trade deals with EU, and we are in an agreement with US. So in the coming future, and especially in India-EU trade deal, how much does climate financing have a role to play? Especially when EU will have norms and they will keep an audit on the products that we supply. They will check on the emissions, and they are going to give us some grants around 500 million pounds. So how much does climate financing has a role to play when it comes to bilateral trade agreements?
I don't think you should look at it from the lens of climate finance. What you should look at is in the lens of what we talked about in the morning, carbon markets, which I have completely kept out of this presentation today. Very consciously I kept that out. But it's something that we need to ask these questions for. See, there's no easy answer to it, and I definitely don't know them, because we still don't even have the full text of the EU-India trade deal. Nor do we have a full text of the India-US trade deal, right? So we really don't know. But what we need to be aware of as journalists is that there is a standard setting happening. That how you measure carbon and what cost, what price you're going to have, because ultimately what is the EU doing? It is comparing our manufacturing, and it's telling our exporters that their carbon pricing needs to be matched, right? Because their carbon pricing has already happened, they have an ETS. They're telling us if you set up a CCTS, then maybe you will get some concessions. So, in effect, in the long run, there could be, possibly, if you listen to the EU economists, a global carbon market which will have a certain, and like Sir was saying in the morning, carbon will become a tradable commodity, which is where things are headed. Because how do you entice private sector to come into the climate space and tell them that there is instant money to be made? Because nobody wants the patient capital part of it, right? You want instant money. How do you make instant money in a collapsing world? Then maybe carbon is the way to go. And so these standards are being set. So are we taking those standards, or are we actually helping set those? What is going to be our say in that CCTS? How are we going to be building our markets? Are we going to be building them based on their standards or our standards? Or will it be US standards? Or will it be Australia standards? So as journalists, we need to watch these spaces. So I'm glad you're watching them. But we'll know only once the fine print is out.
All right, next we'll take up a question from an online participant. Eliza wants to ask this question. It's a more general question. Is there any way we can pressure the global north to commit to their pledges about climate finance? Can we do something to force them to keep their word?
I think I'll give a very personal answer to that. I can't really speak on behalf of the policymakers and how they're thinking. But my question really to our policymakers would be, is it even worth it? Is it something that we want to spend our time and energy doing? Is that, it's good as a negotiation point, it's good as a point of principle, and we hold them to it at COPs. But we're increasingly seeing COPs fail precisely because of this. Because the one end of the world is talking in terms of justice, a language of justice, a language of reparations, a language of past historical emissions, and the other side has been traditionally looking at the lens looking at the world through the lens of what can we market, what can we gain, what can we, So are we even talking to people who we can pressure? And are we even interested in doing that? Or should we just build our own domestic economies and make them so resilient and strong that we really don't need their money while we hold them accountable? I mean, while we hold them accountable bilaterally, maybe plurilaterally, but is the multilateral system even working is a question that I would love to hear answers for.
Professor Chandrasekhar, would you like to respond to this question? Can we do something to force the global north to keep their word?
Yeah, I think he's a better person to answer this.
there are global estimates of what is needed, and there are estimates of what individual countries need to do and can do it on their own grounds. If the discussion is on realizing these global estimates, then it can't be done without pressurizing them. So then
So
what we're
what
saying,
should be done to kick them into action?
yeah, well, the only thing is, if we manage to get a kind of solidarity among nations, other than, let's say, the one particular superpower and maybe Canada too, to actually push them in areas other than asking for climate finance and say that, okay, if you demanding the following things from us, we are coming together and saying you don't get it unless, whereas if you go and join the board of peace, I mean, there's no solidarity left, I mean, so yeah.
Okay, we just have time for one quick question and one answer. You had a question. She asked the first question. She wants to ask the last question. Go ahead. Please be brief. We are running short of time.
So, ma'am, SEBI's BRSR framework, which needs for 1,000 listed companies in India to give their ESG framework accounting. So, India's emission-heavy MSME sector, so that accounts for a large proportion of carbon emissions in India, and also it accounts for 45% of exports in India. So that usually remains unaccounted for their carbon emissions, and which are usually supply chain heavy emissions, which go underreported. So how can the government account for these carbon emissions when we focus on a debate on green finance and climate change?
I think the question, if I understood it right, is about MSMEs. They are not part of this BRSR reporting. So what? How can you make MSMEs who are actually part of the supply chain? They are not covered right now because they come under scope 3 mostly.
Yeah.
They are not under BRSR. How can we make them?
No, but that is also coming in, right? Because as you expand the scope of the disclosures itself, automatically they come under it. Because if 1,000 companies, 1,000 top companies say are going to disclose their, they are going to file their disclosures, they're going to have to ask their supply chains also, because that scope 3 will come. Everybody is preparing for it, as a matter of fact. This confusion is already reigning supreme on how many papers we'll have to file and what we'll have to do and how do you answer this. So that process has already begun. But there is no way that they will be able to stay out of it in the long run if the formalization of the economy continues the way it is going on at the moment through BRSR. But that is also one way to formalize the economy. When you keep filing disclosures and you keep going down to the next person in your supply chain, automatically the data is collected. So they will have to come under it at some point.
So I put it in other words, the market will force them to do it, even if they regulate. Well, all good things will have to come to an end. That was a wonderful session, Archana. Lovely, deeply insightful. Learned a lot myself. So thank you very much, and we'll close the session.